Hi, I'm Sharon Smith, and this is my Mod 14 case study. So my first slide is the summary of the case study. I wrote that the new principal, Richard Inman, who has cultivated positive relationships with a lot of the behavior students in the school, called one such student, James, into the office for a follow-up on his third tardy in a week. As James was on his way to the office, a teacher reported seeing James give something to another student, David. The teacher reported that it might have been drugs. Because of this, David was also brought to the office by the school officer. Both students, the principal and the officer, went into the office for questioning. James admitted to giving David something. David did not speak in the meeting, but he looked fearful. Without informing guardians, David was searched. They found brass knuckles, and David was handcuffed. James quickly admitted to forcibly threatening David into holding the weapon. According to the officer, both students had been taken to jail and charged with a felony weapon on school with felony weapons on school property, and the board would also require a minimum of 45 days expulsion for both students. At this point, the students were taken to the detention center before parents were notified. Inman felt that the system was unjust. He felt trapped between following policies and supporting the best interest of his students. Ultimately, he decided to file the mandatory expulsion paperwork against James, but not against David. 1 week later, David was back at school, and the board asked Inman to file the proper paperwork to adhere to the district's zero tolerance policy or face an official reprimand. So in this slide, I'm supposed to evaluate the ethical dimensions of the issues. And I feel like most of the harm happened to David, if not all of it. David was harmed by the actions of several individuals and groups. He was harmed by the student, James, who forcibly threatened David into holding the weapon. The action, to me, constitutes harassment by a student, and school policies exist for these situations. He was harmed by the teacher and principal who did not allow David time to process what had happened to him when he was forced to carry the item without consent. Note, he was immediately called to the office, according to the case study. The action likely violates David's right to protection by school officials. Ethically, school leaders and staff are responsible for protecting students. David was also harmed by the officer who was treating him like a violent criminal by handcuffing him unnecessarily. Unless there was a policy that required the officer to handcuff David, I felt like that was unnecessary. David was also harmed by the Board of Education, who would force equal treatment of students for unequal violations of the no weapons policy. The action violates David's legal rights to a fair hearing. So in section 3, I was supposed to synthesize in one sentence. So in this case study, Principal Inman was faced with an ethical dilemma when he inadvertently placed an innocent student in harm's way during an investigation, and the student was forced to face severe consequences because of that choice. Okay, so some of the items that I thought were missing, some of the facts that I thought were important but we didn't know as readers about people, were that David did not have time to make a thought-out decision about how to react when being threatened. I felt like that was a fact. The teacher, officer, and principal did not know what James wanted David to hold. So nobody really knew what James had given to David. It could have been totally innocent. So I feel like James was guilty before they even knew if anything had really taken place. And that's why an officer walked down to the classroom. The officer also handcuffed David, but not James. Parents were only notified after the students had been taken to the detention center. James admitted to forcing David to hold the item. Were questioned in front of each other and in the same room. David was labeled a good kid and James was labeled a bad kid. Readers do not know the race of the students. James was an influential student within the Southside Circle. James had a negative student record and had been in trouble multiple times before. Both of the students were boys. David had never been in trouble and had a positive student record. Place. This community, rural, urban, suburban. and the school's condition, climates, norms, and customs were not identified. Program. The district had a disciplinary alternative education program in place for expelled students. This is a public school because it has a district. This event took place in a high school, secondary education. So in Section 5, we like to recognize the stakeholders in this conflict and event. I would say that David is a stakeholder because the outcome of this event could have already altered his trust in the system, his emotional well-being, and his future. The principal is a stakeholder because if he does not follow district policy and file paperwork, he could face official reprimand. The officer is a stakeholder because if there was a district policy to handcuff felony offenders, he could face reprimand for only handcuffing David, not James. David's parents are stakeholders and could be harmed by the situation because the outcome of this event could diminish their trust in the school and district. His parents were not notified until after the students were taken to the detention center. The board are stakeholders because the outcome of events impacts their standing as a district. The board was never formally notified about David. The board could be liable of unfair treatment because the violations were not equal between David and James, but are being treated as if both boys committed the same crime. I think I do have enough information to make a decision about how I would handle David's situation and how Inman should have handled David and James. However, I also feel like I have more to learn about the situation. I would like to know a few different things. 1. Is there a district policy to handcuff felony offenders? Unless there was a policy, it was unnecessary to handcuff David. Is there a planned expulsion hearing within 10 days of the event? And could this date be expedited? An early hearing would be better for David's mental health. Also, Inman would have an earlier opportunity to advocate on David's behalf. Why was the officer involved at the start of questioning? James was in the office for tardies, and David had no known reason to be in trouble. So, why did the officer get involved? Since David was forcibly threatened into holding the weapon, is there a school policy in place for harassment and bullying situations? Okay, so possible consequences, options, and then consequences. So if I were making this decision in place of Inman, I could not make any decision or take any action that would be an option. I could do exactly as Inman had done. I could have questioned David without his aggressor or the officer in the room. I could have called district office to advocate for David by phone and ask them if they would be okay to not file the expulsion paperwork due to circumstances. I could have filed the expulsion paper, but also went to the hearing to advocate on David's behalf. So my favorite option was actually the last one. I could have questioned David without his aggressor, or I could have filed the expulsion papers, but advocated for David at the hearing. Okay, so on this slide, I really just evaluate my options. I think David is a stakeholder because the outcome of this event could have already altered his trust in the system, his emotional well-being, and his future. A pro for this would be he would be more vocal if someone like James were to put him in a position like this again. The con would be that this event could have already altered his trust in the system and his emotional well-being. The principal is a stakeholder because if he does not follow district policy and file paperwork, he could face reprimanding. He would likely handle a situation like this differently. And as a con, he would obviously receive some reprimands. The officer is a stakeholder because if there was a district policy to handcuff felony offenders, he could face reprimanding for only handcuffing David, not James. Pro, he could have been following protocol. Or the con, he may not have been following protocol. His actions may have been unnecessary, aggressive. David's parents are stakeholders and could be harmed by this situation because of the outcome of this event could diminish the trust in the school and district. And the board are stakeholders because the outcome of events impact their standing as a district. So I decided to make some decisions on maybe what I would do in this situation. So I said if I am under the current circumstances, if the story was just left off at the second where he had the reprimand, I feel like the best decision up to that point would be for the principal Inman to file the expulsion paperwork as he was supposed to. At the same time, be preparing evidence and a case to present to the board to advocate for David at his hearing. If I was Inman, I would have paused my tardy's meeting with James to go visit David alone. I would have asked him about the event that took place in the hall. He would have been sat in he would have been sat in or to wait in the office and while I met with James to ask him about the event that took place in the hall. If the story was told as it was in the case, James would be the only child going to the detention center with the officer and the brass knuckles because I would have listed David as a victim, not a criminal. Both sets of parents would have been immediately notified after all the details were gathered. I would have called district office and told them about the event in its entirety. I would tell them that I was going to file paperwork on James, but not David, due to circumstances. If they insisted on me filing the paperwork on David, I would, but I would also prepare evidence in the case to present to the board to advocate for David in his hearing, and I would rush the hearing so that he would experience less harm. So, what steps should have been taken to ensure that others are acting ethically? And what do you do when you recognize when ethics have been breached, and what appropriate actions do you take? Well, I felt like I addressed this question when I said I would tell them that I was going to file paperwork on James, the board, but not David, due to circumstances. If they insisted on me filing paperwork on David, I would, but I would also prepare evidence in a case to present to the board to advocate for David. How do you employ ethical decision-making practices regarding policies? Well, over here I have prepare evidence and a case to present to the board. I feel like dragging out a hearing and an invalid judgment could affect the student's reputation and trust with the school, so it's important for us to ethically move quickly. The teacher, officer, and principal did not know what James wanted David to hold, so I feel like there was some accusing the students from the start could have adversely affected relationships, so they should be careful about accusations without evidence. And then I was supposed to choose the best option. So Inman needed to follow the district policy and file the paperwork. He is a leader and an example to others, staff, in the school. He needs to model ethical behavior in his personal conduct. In addition, he could cultivate ethical behavior in others by encouraging and developing positive decision making in others, as we saw when James decided to stand up for David at school. Thank you for the class, and I hope you appreciated my case study.